What if your bloodline, meant to ensure power, became the very curse that destroyed your mind, your body, your future? For centuries, royal families clung to one idea: keep the blood pure, keep the throne safe. But the cost? Hidden in hospital wings, family crypts, and medical records no one wanted to open. Our story begins with Isabella II of Spain, crowned queen as a child in 1833. Her birth was celebrated. Her father had longed for a male heir, but settled for her. What no one said out loud: Isabella's genes were already poisoned. Her father was her mother's uncle. Her grandparents on one side were also her great-grandparents on the other. Her health, and that of her sister, raised quiet alarms early on: pale, often sick, withdrawn. At just 16, Isabella was forced to marry her double second cousin. 11 pregnancies followed. Only 5 children survived infancy. And rumors haunted the court. Her husband, likely gay, may have fathered none of them. The royal line continued, but the damage was done. And being queen didn't protect her from it. Next on this twisted lineage is Marie Louise of Austria, a woman born into one of the most genetically entangled dynasties in Europe. Her parents weren't just cousins. They were double first cousins, meaning they shared both sets of grandparents. That gave Marie Louise only 4 unique great-grandparents, half the normal number for a human being. In modern genetics, that level of compression is seen only in the most isolated populations. But this wasn't a remote village. This was the Habsburg Empire, and the damage was being done at the very top. Marie Louise was married off at 18 to Napoleon Bonaparte, a calculated move to secure peace after France had battered Austria in war. To her, Napoleon wasn't a hero, he was her father's former enemy. But dynastic duty didn't allow for preference. The pressure on her shoulders was enormous: produce a healthy heir and legitimize a brutal alliance. But no amount of diplomacy could undo what centuries of intermarriage had set in motion. Her body carried the weight of decisions made generations before she was born. We leave the palaces of Europe and land in modern-day America, where the consequences of inbreeding still echo, not through royal decrees, but through isolation, poverty, and silence. In a now infamous documentary, the Whittaker family of rural West Virginia stunned the world. Among them, Lorraine Whittaker stands out as one of the most genetically affected individuals in recent memory. But this isn't a curiosity, it's a tragedy passed down through generations of unchecked intermarriage. Lorraine is also the mother of Timmy Whittaker, whose condition is so severe, he's often referred to as the most visibly impacted by genetic collapse in the Western world. Their story isn't about ancient crowns or dynasties. It's about what happens when the walls close in, when poverty, stigma, and isolation trap families in a genetic loop they can't escape. There were no golden thrones here, no arranged marriages for power. Just a remote community, far from public view, where each generation slipped deeper into silence. And the result? As heartbreaking and as biologically devastating as any royal scandal. Back in 18th century Portugal, royalty paid the price for its obsession with bloodline control. Maria the Queen of Portugal, known formally as Maria the Pious, was crowned in 1777, but her reign would be overshadowed by a steady mental collapse. Her parents, King Joseph I of Portugal and Maria Anna of Spain, were already part of a long chain of Iberian royal unions. By the time Maria came of age, she was under pressure to keep the bloodline intact. So she married her own uncle. The union was political, expected, but the genetic consequences followed fast. Of Maria's children, half died young, likely victims of the same inherited weaknesses bred into her. By midlife, Maria's behavior grew erratic. Court records describe a woman slipping into confusion, religious delusions, and intense emotional breakdowns. Eventually, she was declared mentally unfit to rule and replaced by her son. Her story wasn't rare, it was systemic. In royal circles, these weren't isolated cases. They were patterns, and the deeper they went, the more irreversible the damage became. Now we enter the tragic life of Marie-Louise Élisabeth d'Orléans, a French royal whose story reads like a Gothic novel soaked in sorrow. Her father, Philippe II, Duke of Orléans, was pushed to marry his own cousin, an illegitimate daughter of Louis XIV. The union was less about love than dynastic survival. From that tangled bloodline came Marie-Louise, the eldest child, burdened from birth with expectations she couldn't escape. As soon as she was old enough, she too was married off, again to a close cousin, Charles of Berry, grandson of Louis XIV. 3 pregnancies followed, 3 funerals. Not one child lived past infancy. Historical records suggest she turned to alcohol alarmingly early. Reports say she began drinking heavily at 14 years old. It wasn't defiance, it was coping. A quiet form of collapse under the weight of grief, pressure, and genetic ruin. She had no control over the blood in her veins, nor over the dynasty that demanded she pass it on, damaged or not. Her downfall wasn't scandal. It was the slow erosion of a person born to serve a broken system. While her name rarely makes headlines, Princess Alexia of Greece, born in 1965, carries the weight of one of Europe's last royal inbreeding legacies. Her parents, Queen Anne-Marie of Denmark and King Constantine II of Greece, were united not just by love, but by blood. They were related twice over, second cousins and third cousins. The branches of their family trees twisted back into themselves, forming a royal loop of shared ancestors. This wasn't accidental, it was tradition, one designed to preserve political alliances, even as the world outside changed. Constantine's lineage is especially tangled. One of his grandmothers was the sister of his great-grandfather, meaning inherited traits passed down with double force. And while their marriage appeared affectionate to the public, the genetic consequences were built in. Alexia and her siblings were born into a fading world, one where royal titles still held symbolic weight, but the science of heredity had caught up. Their very existence marked the final echoes of a dynasty slowly unraveling under its own genetic weight. Their story mirrors that of Britain's royals. Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip were also third cousins. But what those bloodlines protected in the past, science can no longer ignore. She was called Maria Antonia of Austria, a Habsburg royal so deeply inbred that her DNA chart looked more like a spiral than a tree. While her infamous uncle, Charles II of Spain, is often cited as the peak of Habsburg genetic collapse, Maria Antonia may have surpassed even him. Her ancestry was so twisted that modern geneticists estimate her coefficient of inbreeding, a measure of how genetically similar her parents were, rivaled that of a child born to full siblings. That level of genetic repetition is almost unheard of outside controlled lab studies or small, isolated populations. She wasn't born into obscurity. Maria Antonia was raised among marble halls and royal tutors, but every privilege masked the cost of centuries of forced alliances. Her body was the final ledger of hundreds of years of political marriages, and it bore the marks: poor health, vulnerability to illness, and no surviving children. History often overlooks her, but her genetic profile is a warning, one too extreme to ignore. She wasn't just royalty, she was the product of a dynasty that looped so tightly inward it collapsed under the weight of its own blood. Sometimes history forgets names, but the evidence remains, sealed in bone. Deep in the Peruvian Andes, two mummified remains known only as 317A and 317B were discovered in a high-altitude tomb. What shocked researchers wasn't just their preservation, it was what their DNA revealed. Tests showed the pair shared an extreme level of inbreeding. One had a genetic profile equivalent to that of a child born from parent-sibling incest. In ancient royal societies, this wasn't entirely uncommon. Maintaining divine blood often meant marrying inside the family, even to extremes modern ethics can't fathom. The two mummies weren't preserved as monsters, they were buried with care, with symbols of rank and reverence. Whoever they were, their society viewed them as elite. But science tells a harsher truth: their suffering was likely profound. Inbreeding on that scale often leads to congenital defects, deformities, and neurological issues. No names remain, no crowns. Just silent remains, whispering a story older than Europe's monarchies. One where genetics and power collided long before castles and titles. From ancient tombs to one of Europe's most infamous monarchs, Joanna of Castile, remembered by history as Juana la Loca or Joanna the Mad. But madness isn't born in a vacuum, and Joanna's case may have been written into her DNA long before she lost her crown. She was the daughter of Isabella I of Castile and Ferdinand II of Aragon, the same Catholic monarchs who united Spain and funded Columbus. But behind their political brilliance was a family tree already showing signs of strain. By the time Joanna was born, the Spanish royal bloodline had cycled through repeated cousin marriages for generations. Joanna married Philip the Handsome, a Habsburg, deepening the genetic spiral. She gave birth to 6 children, one of whom became the infamous Charles V, a ruler whose own inbreeding would affect half of Europe. But Joanna's mental deterioration was swift. Her obsession with her husband's fidelity, episodes of paranoia, and deep emotional instability weren't just romantic tragedy. They may have been symptoms of hereditary conditions, worsened by generations of shared blood. She spent nearly 50 years imprisoned, outliving her husband, her crown, and the sanity they said she lost. But the truth, her collapse wasn't madness, it was dynasty. And now we reach the end of the list, but the beginning of a dynasty's collapse. At number 1 stands Cleopatra II Philopator, a queen of Egypt whose story is rarely told. Yet her life may be one of the most disturbing case studies of royal inbreeding ever recorded. She ruled during the 2nd century BCE, a time when the Ptolemaic dynasty was already collapsing under the weight of its own blood rituals. The Ptolemies, descended from one of Alexander the Great's generals, believed in divine purity. That meant marrying their siblings. Not once, not twice, but generation after generation. Cleopatra II followed that path. She married her full brother, Ptolemy VI, and after his death, married her second brother, Ptolemy VIII. Then it gets darker. Her daughter, Cleopatra III, was also forced to marry her own uncle, the same Ptolemy VIII, who had once been Cleopatra II's husband. This wasn't royalty. This was a closed genetic system, spiraling downward into madness, betrayal, and violent power grabs. Cleopatra II eventually led a rebellion against her own husband-brother, and he retaliated by killing their son and sending the dismembered corpse to her as a message. The dynasty outlived her, but just barely. Within a century, the last Ptolemaic queen, Cleopatra VII, would take her life as Roman conquest swallowed what was left. This wasn't just political collapse, it was genetic extinction, written in flesh and blood. The dynasty he was meant to continue ended with his breath. But the deeper tragedy, his body was never his own. It was a sacrifice made centuries before he was born, in the name of blood and crown.